My name is Marissa Cole. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've worked inside companies where things move fast, decisions are messy, and someone always has to quietly make sense of what everyone else leaves unfinished. On paper, I'm a product operations analyst at a mid-sized SaaS company in Austin, Texas. In practice, I've been the person people come to when something breaks, when a deadline slips, or when two teams stop speaking the same language. If you asked most people I've worked with to describe me, they'd probably say I'm reliable, organized, calm. Good with people. They might add that I don't seek the spotlight, that I'm not particularly loud in meetings, that I'm not the kind of person who fights to be seen. None of that would be wrong, but it would be incomplete. What people often mistake for a lack of ambition is, in reality, a different relationship with power. I learned early on that if you stay steady, if you don't embarrass others, if you quietly solve problems instead of announcing them, you become useful. And when you're useful, people lean on you, sometimes gently, sometimes heavily. Over time, that leaning can turn into something else entirely. This story isn't about a dramatic confrontation or a clever revenge. There are no explosive arguments, no public takedowns, no moment where everyone suddenly claps. It's about what happens when your work is absorbed into someone else's story, when your steadiness becomes invisible, when being the one who holds things together slowly costs you your own standing. I want to be clear about what this story is and what it isn't. It isn't a warning about trusting people too much, and it isn't a manifesto about demanding credit at all costs. It's a quiet account of how systems reward certain behaviors and erase others, and how clarity, once gained, can't be unlearned. Over the course of this story, I'll walk you through how I was seen, how small moments of dismissal accumulated, and how silence, first chosen out of fear, later out of intention, became something else entirely. The justice here is not emotional, it's structural. It arrives through documentation, timing, and a shift in who is trusted when things matter. I'm telling this in my own voice, not to dramatize the past, but to document it honestly. Because I know there are people listening who have been dependable for years, who have been called a lifesaver but never a leader, who have stayed quiet because they didn't want to be labeled difficult or unstable. This story is for you, not to inflame you, but to steady you. So as we begin, I'll ask you something gently, without expectation. Have you ever been essential to a system that never learned how to see you? At work, I was the person people spoke about in passing, not in rooms where decisions were made. If my name came up, it was usually attached to a sentence like, "Marissa will know," or "Marissa can help with that." I existed in the connective tissue of the company, the spaces between teams, between deadlines, between what was promised and what was actually delivered. I joined the company during a period of quiet instability. We were growing, but not cleanly. Processes were half-built, ownership was blurred, and everyone was slightly overwhelmed. I didn't arrive with a grand plan or a hunger to be noticed. I arrived with questions. I listened more than I spoke. I took notes when for others relied on memory. And when something fell through the cracks, I picked it up because it bothered me not to. That pattern formed quickly. A product launch would stumble because requirements weren't aligned, and I'd stay late mapping dependencies so the next one wouldn't. Two teams would argue about whose responsibility something was, and I'd step in to clarify timelines and unblock them. Leadership started to trust that if Marissa was involved, things wouldn't explode. They didn't necessarily know how I did it. They just knew the outcome was calmer. Over time, that calm became my identity. I was steady. I was safe. I was the person managers felt comfortable looping in without worrying about ego or pushback. That sounds flattering, and in some ways it was, but it also came with an unspoken ceiling. Steady people are rarely seen as drivers. Safe people are rarely seen as bold. And boldness, not consistency, is what tends to get rewarded. In meetings, I was often asked to recap what had already happened, to summarize the decisions that had been made without me in the room, to explain why something was late, even when the delay had nothing to do with my work. I did it without resentment, because I believed clarity mattered more than credit. If everyone understood the truth of the situation, I assumed, recognition would eventually follow. What I didn't realize then was how completely I was being defined by my usefulness. I wasn't seen as someone with a point of view about strategy. I was seen as someone who could make strategy executable after the fact. I wasn't invited to shape direction. I was invited to clean up outcomes. No one said this out loud. It was expressed in small ways. The way conversations paused until I answered, then moved on. The way decisions were announced as final, followed by, "Marissa, can you document this?" The way my calendar filled up with meetings was such that my role was to absorb confusion and send out clarity afterward. I didn't experience this as cruelty. There was no villain twirling a mustache, no overt dismissal. In fact, people were polite, appreciative even. I was thanked often. But thanks are not the same as trust, and appreciation is not the same as authority. If I'm honest, I participated in my own invisibility. I believed that being indispensable would eventually make me undeniable. I believed that if I kept things running smoothly, someone would notice the pattern. I told myself that titles were superficial, that real influence came from being relied upon. And for a while, that belief held. I felt needed. I felt competent. I felt calm while others panicked. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the gap between how much I carried and how I was perceived began to widen. I was holding the threads of projects together, but I wasn't holding a narrative about myself. To them, I was a resource, a reliable one, a quiet one, someone who could be leaned on without resistance. I don't think anyone intended to diminish me, but intention doesn't change outcome. And the outcome was this. When people looked at me, they saw support, not leadership, stability, not vision. At the time, I accepted that role without protest. I thought it was temporary. I thought it was neutral. I didn't yet understand how roles, once assigned, have a way of solidifying if they're never challenged. And that was who I was to them, long before anything went wrong. The first time it happened, it was small enough that I almost convinced myself it hadn't happened at all. We were in a quarterly planning meeting, one of those long, slightly unfocused sessions where everyone talks about alignment more than they actually align. I had spent the previous 2 weeks untangling dependencies between product, sales, and customer success. There had been overlapping promises, contradictory timelines, and at least 3 decisions that had been quietly reversed without documentation. I did what I always did. I traced everything back, clarified what had changed and why, and built a clean, realistic plan that everyone had signed off on individually. In the meeting, my manager presented the plan. That wasn't unusual. Analysts don't usually present to leadership, and I was used to my work being surfaced through someone else's voice. What was different was the framing. He spoke about bringing structure to chaos, about creating a new operational rhythm, about finally having visibility. He used phrases I recognized because they came directly from the document I had written, sometimes word for word. I listened carefully, waiting for the moment when he'd reference the work, or at least the process behind it. It never came. When a senior leader asked how long this approach had been in development, he answered confidently, "We've been thinking about this for a while." When someone commented on how clear the timelines were, he nodded and said, "Yeah, we really tightened things up. No malice, no deception that could be easily called out. Just a quiet absorption." My work folded seamlessly into his narrative. I remember the exact physical sensation of that moment. A tightening in my chest, not anger, more like disorientation. I told myself I was being sensitive, that this was how organizations worked, that credit flowed upward, and that was normal. Still, I wrote a timestamp in my notes. Not emotionally, just factually. Date, meeting name, who said what. After the meeting, a few people messaged me privately. "Great job on that plan," one said. Another wrote, "So glad you got us aligned." Their words were kind, and they softened the edge of what I felt. I told myself this was enough. Recognition doesn't always have to be public. Impact matters more, but something had shifted. For the first time, I saw how easily my contributions could be separated from my name, how the company could benefit from my clarity without ever associating it with me as a thinker or a leader. The system didn't resist this. It enabled it. What struck me most was how invisible the moment was to everyone else. No one reacted. No one seemed uncomfortable. This wasn't seen as taking. It was seen as representing. And representation, I realized, is power. I went back to my desk and did what I always did. I followed up with notes. I updated timelines. I answered questions. Outwardly, nothing changed. Inwardly, a small line had been crossed. I didn't confront my manager. There was no clear accusation to make. If I said that was my work, It would sound defensive, petty even. I could already imagine the response. Of course it was a team effort, or worse, you should have spoken up. So I stayed quiet, not because I agreed, but because I didn't yet know what silence could become. At that point, silence still felt like self-preservation. That moment didn't hurt because it was dramatic. It hurt because it was subtle, and because it revealed a truth I hadn't wanted to see. Being indispensable didn't protect me from being overwritten. Everyone else moved on. I didn't. I remembered it, not with resentment, but with clarity. And that memory would matter later, in ways I couldn't yet predict. After that first moment, nothing changed on the surface. That was the most dangerous part. If something had exploded, an argument, a public slight, I might have been forced to address it. Instead, what followed was a pattern so quiet, it almost passed for normal professional life. My manager began to reference his framework more often. The framework was, in reality, an evolving set of documents and decision logs I maintained. Each time a new version was mentioned in a meeting, it was spoken of as an extension of his leadership style. I was still in the room sometimes, still asked to clarify details, but never positioned as the origin. At first, I corrected nothing. I told myself that titles and credit were fluid, that what mattered was the work continuing smoothly. I rationalized my silence by pointing to my personality. I wasn't confrontational. I valued harmony. I didn't want to create tension over something that could be interpreted as ego. There was also fear. Not the dramatic kind, but the professional kind that sits quietly in your stomach. I had seen what happened to people labeled difficult. They weren't fired, they were sidelined, excluded from conversations, trusted a little less. I had built my reputation on being steady, and I was afraid that asserting myself would fracture that image. So when my work appeared in slides without my name, I told myself it was efficient. When my manager summarized decisions I had coordinated as if they were his calls, I told myself leadership needed a single voice. When senior leaders praised him for bringing order, I clapped along with everyone else. The normalization happened slowly. Each instance on its own was easy to excuse. Together, they formed a quiet erosion. My role narrowed without anyone explicitly redefining it. I became the person who executed, not the person who originated. The one who maintained, not the one who shaped. What made it harder was that people still relied on me deeply. If something went wrong, I was pulled in immediately. If a timeline slipped, I was asked to investigate. If two leaders disagreed, I was asked to reconcile their versions of events. I was trusted with the truth, but not with the authority that comes from being seen as its source. I began to notice how language shifted around me. In meetings, phrases like "we decided" replaced "Marissa found." Questions were directed to my manager, even when the answers lived in my documents. I was still speaking, but less, still present, but increasingly peripheral. I adapted in ways I didn't fully recognize at the time. I became more precise in my notes, more careful with timestamps, more neutral in tone. Not because I was planning anything, but because something in me sensed that clarity might be needed later. I didn't announce ideas anymore. I documented them. I didn't argue. I recorded outcomes. To anyone watching, I looked the same, calm, helpful, unbothered. In Faisal, I was slowly recalibrating my understanding of the environment I was in. I was learning that respect doesn't disappear all at once. It thins layer by layer, until one day you realize you're standing in the same place, doing the same work, but occupying far less space. I told myself this was temporary, that once things stabilized, once leadership saw the full picture, roles would rebalance. I believed in the fairness of systems because it was comforting to do so. Believing otherwise would have required me to change something, and I wasn't ready. So I normalized it. I absorbed the discomfort and smoothed it over, the way I smoothed over everything else. I convinced myself that staying quiet was the mature choice, the professional choice, the safe choice. What I didn't understand yet was that every time I chose silence without intention, I was teaching others how to treat me. And lessons once learned are rarely unlearned without consequence. It wasn't assigned in a meeting. No one sat me down and explained it. There was no document, no announcement. The role emerged the way these things often do, through repetition, assumption, and silence. I was the one who would take care of it. Whenever something was unclear, my name came up. Whenever a process broke, I was expected to patch it. Whenever leadership needed reassurance that things were under control, I was quietly looped in to make that reassurance real. Over time, this became so natural that people stopped asking if I had the capacity. They assumed I would find it. The role came with a certain kind of praise. "We couldn't do this without you. You're such a stabilizing force. You always keep things moving." These comments were meant kindly, and I received them with grace, but none of them came with authority. None of them changed how decisions were made or who was credited for them. What became clear was that I had been placed in a category that felt comfortable to everyone else. I was reliable, useful, and invisible enough not to threaten existing hierarchies. I made other people look effective. I reduced friction. I absorbed blame when timelines slipped and deflected attention when things went right. I began to see how predictable my presence had become. In meetings, people spoke more freely around me because they knew I wouldn't challenge them publicly. They would say, "Marissa will clean this up," as if that were a neutral statement, not a transfer of responsibility. And because I didn't object, the statement solidified into expectation. There was a moment, small but telling, when a colleague joked, "If everything falls apart, we'll just throw Marissa at it." Everyone laughed. I smiled too. On the surface, it sounded like trust. Underneath, it revealed how narrowly I was seen. I wasn't asked what I wanted next. I wasn't invited into conversations about growth or direction. When promotions were discussed, they were framed as leadership paths that required visibility, decisiveness, and assertiveness, qualities implicitly contrasted with my calm, accommodating style. No one said I lacked ambition. They simply assumed I was content where I was. The truth was more complicated. I wasn't uninterested in leadership. I was uninterested in performative dominance. I believed competence would speak for itself. I believed that if I kept the system running, the system would eventually recognize me. That belief kept me compliant longer than I cared to admit. What I didn't see at first was how the role protected everyone else. As long as I was there to smooth transitions, others didn't have to confront their own gaps. As long as I documented decisions, no one else had to remember them. As long as I quietly resolved conflicts, leaders could appear decisive without doing the work of alignment. The role also protected me from risk, from exposure, from conflict. In that sense, it was seductive. It allowed me to avoid uncomfortable conversations. It let me tell myself that patience was a virtue, that endurance was strength. But roles, once settled, are hard to escape. And the longer I stayed inside this one, the more it defined how people interpreted everything I did. When I offered an idea, it was heard as a suggestion, not a direction. When I raised a concern, it was treated as a detail to be managed, not a signal to reconsider course. I didn't feel angry. I felt contained. And somewhere in that containment, a quiet understanding began to form. If I didn't redefine myself, no one else would do it for me. The role I had been assigned was not malicious, but it was limiting. And it was stable enough to last forever, unless something shifted. At the time, I didn't know what that shift would be. I only knew that continuing as I was meant accepting a future where my influence remained indirect and my presence remained convenient. That realization didn't lead to action yet. It led to awareness. And awareness, once it settles in, has a way of changing how you move through a room. The shift didn't come with a confrontation. There was no raised voice, no dramatic email, no moment where I finally stood up for myself. It came on an ordinary afternoon, in an ordinary meeting, in a way that would have been forgettable if I hadn't been paying attention. We were reviewing a post-mortem for a delayed feature release. These meetings were meant to be factual, but they often drifted toward narrative. Who anticipated what? Who owned which decision? Where things really went wrong? I had prepared the timeline as usual. It was precise, unemotional, and complete. Every dependency, every decision point, every handoff was clearly documented. As the discussion unfolded, my manager spoke confidently about how he had identified risks early and adjusted priorities to minimize impact. The story was clean, too clean. I watched as the room accepted it without question. Then someone asked a question that cut through the narrative. Why wasn't this escalated sooner? There was a pause. My manager glanced at me just briefly before answering. We didn't have full visibility at the time. That sentence landed differently than the others. Not because it was loud or accusatory, but because it quietly contradicted reality. We had visibility. I had documented the risk weeks earlier. I had flagged it in writing. I had followed up. In that moment, I felt something settle inside me. Not anger, not fear, but clarity. I saw the shape of the pattern all at once. My work was being used to support a story that wasn't entirely true, and my silence was part of what made that possible. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct him. I let the meeting continue as it always did. But internally, something shifted. I stopped asking myself whether I was overreacting. I stopped framing my discomfort as sensitivity. I understood finally that this wasn't about one person or one meeting. It was about how narratives form when documentation and voice are separated. After the meeting, I went back to my desk and opened my notes. I didn't change anything. I didn't add commentary. I simply reviewed what was already there: dates, messages, decisions, risks raised and acknowledged. For the first time, I saw my notes not just as tools for alignment, but as a record of truth. Not emotional truth, but structural truth, the kind that exists regardless of who tells the story. That realization didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel responsible for how my work was being used, and for what my continued silence enabled. I understood that speaking up impulsively would change nothing. It would trigger defensiveness, maybe even backlash, but doing nothing would guarantee that the pattern continued. The shift was internal, but it was decisive. I stopped seeing silence as the default. I began to see it as a choice, one that could be used deliberately, not passively. I didn't know yet what that choice would look like, but I knew it would be mine. That day, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't update my resume. I didn't make plans. I simply adjusted how I observed. I listened more carefully. I noted not just what was said, but what was omitted. I paid attention to how stories were told and whose work they rested on. Nothing changed outwardly. People left the meeting satisfied. Decisions moved forward. The system kept running, but inside me, something fundamental had realigned. I no longer believed that being indispensable was enough. I no longer believed that patience alone would correct the imbalance. I had crossed a line, from endurance to awareness. And once that line is crossed, there's no going back to not seeing what you see. After that day, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been reflexive, a way to keep things smooth, to avoid friction, to protect my place in the system. Now, it was intentional. I still spoke when clarity was needed, still answered questions, still did the work. But I stopped filling gaps that weren't mine to fill. I stopped preemptively fixing problems that others hadn't yet acknowledged. To anyone watching, I probably looked the same: calm, professional, unbothered. But internally, I was making small, deliberate adjustments. When decisions were made without full information, I documented the decision and the missing context instead of rushing to resolve it. When timelines were announced prematurely, I noted the assumption rather than scrambling to make it true. This wasn't passive-aggressive. I wasn't withholding information or setting traps. I was simply allowing reality to remain visible. For the first time, I wasn't cushioning others from the consequences of their own shortcuts. What surprised me was how quickly my silence was misinterpreted. Because I didn't object, people assumed agreement. Because I didn't rescue, they assumed everything was under control. My manager continued to speak with confidence, unaware that the safety net had shifted from invisible support to visible record. There was a subtle change in how I worked. My notes became more explicit about ownership. My follow-ups referenced prior decisions with precision. I began to ask clarifying questions in writing rather than resolving ambiguities privately. Not accusatory questions, just accurate ones. Can you confirm this decision replaces the earlier plan from March 12th? Who is accountable for this dependency? Is this timeline based on the assumption that X is complete? These questions didn't slow things down. They simply anchored them, and in doing so, they changed how my silence functioned. It was no longer an absence of voice. It was a record presence. Others didn't notice this shift immediately. They were accustomed to me smoothing edges, not sharpening them. When minor issues began to surface, miscommunications, missed handoffs, there was mild confusion, nothing dramatic. Just a sense that things felt slightly less padded. I watched this without satisfaction or guilt. I wasn't trying to teach anyone a lesson. I was trying to align my actions with reality. If I continued to silently absorb everything, I would remain invisible. If I made the structure visible, my role within it would inevitably change. What I didn't anticipate was how uncomfortable that visibility would make others, not because it exposed wrongdoing, but because it removed plausible deniability. Decisions now had names attached. Assumptions were documented. The story couldn't drift as easily. My manager began to check in more often. "Everything okay?" he'd ask casually. I'd nod. "Yes, just making sure we're aligned." Which was true. Alignment, I had learned, is not the same as agreement. Silence, when chosen deliberately, has weight. It creates space. And in that space, patterns either correct themselves or become undeniable. I was no longer protecting the system from itself. I was observing it clearly. This wasn't a power move. It was a recalibration. I wasn't withdrawing. I was repositioning, quietly, carefully, without announcement. To them, my silence still looked like compliance. To me, it had become a strategy. While everything on the surface remained familiar, something was quietly changing underneath. Not in them and me. I had always kept notes, but now I began to see them differently. Not as reminders, not as personal aids, but as a map of how decisions actually moved through the company. I noticed how often the same issues resurfaced under different names, how frequently accountability blurred at the edges, how narratives evolved depending on who was speaking. I didn't set out to prepare in a dramatic sense. There was no master plan, no secret folder labeled anything ominous. I simply continued doing what I had always done, only now, with intention. Every meeting note was time-stamped. Every decision was linked to its context. Every change was tracked, not emotionally, but structurally. I began to recognize patterns in how my manager operated. He wasn't malicious. He was confident, articulate, and skilled at storytelling. He genuinely believed he was leading effectively. What he didn't see was how much of that effectiveness relied on unacknowledged scaffolding I maintained. I also noticed how leadership consumed information. They didn't want raw complexity, they wanted coherence. Whoever provided that coherence became trusted. The danger, I realized, was that coherence could be divorced from its source. So I adjusted how information flowed. I made sure my documentation was accessible, neutral, and complete. I stopped summarizing things verbally inside conversations. If something mattered, it went into the record. If it didn't, I let it fade. This wasn't about catching anyone in a lie. It was about allowing the truth to exist independently of any single narrator. Over time, a quiet archive formed, not hidden, but overlooked. Because no one expects leverage to come from someone who doesn't announce it. I also began to learn more about the business itself. Not just my slice of it, but how decisions affected revenue, customer retention, and operational risk. I asked questions that expanded my understanding, not my visibility. I listened to how executives spoke when they thought they were among peers. What I was building wasn't a case, it was a position, a place from which I could act if I chose to, or not. The choice mattered. They never noticed because nothing about my demeanor changed. I didn't become sharper or colder. I didn't withdraw. I remained helpful, composed, steady. That steadiness was what allowed everything else to go unseen. In some ways, this was the loneliest part. There was no one to talk to about what I was noticing, no one to validate the shift. I wasn't angry enough to vent, and not uncertain enough to ask for advice. I was simply awake. I understood then that quiet people are often underestimated, not because they lack power, but because they don't perform it. And systems that reward performance over substance are blind to the kind of leverage that accumulates slowly, through consistency. By the time the groundwork was laid, no one had realized anything had changed at all. The reveal didn't come from a single discovery. It came from connecting things I already had. One afternoon, while preparing a routine update, I traced a decision back through my notes to understand why a dependency existed in the first place. That led me to an earlier meeting, then another, and another. What emerged wasn't surprising, but it was clarifying. Several of the company's most praised turnarounds shared the same quiet origin point. Each one had begun as a messy situation, had passed through my documentation, and had emerged as a clean narrative attributed to leadership intervention. Not falsely, just incompletely. I sat with that realization longer than I expected. Not because it made me feel wronged, but because it explained so much. The promotions, the trust, the perception of decisiveness. I wasn't invisible because my work lacked impact. I was invisible because my impact was being laundered through someone else's authority. What struck me most was how fragile that authority actually was. Without the record, without the timeline, without the dependency mapping, the story fell apart. Not dramatically, but structurally. Claims couldn't be supported. Decisions couldn't be traced. Accountability dissolved. This wasn't something I could expose in a meeting or an email. It wasn't a gotcha. It was leverage of a quieter kind. The ability to clarify truth when clarity became necessary. I realized then that I didn't need to demand recognition. I didn't need to confront or accuse. All I needed was to stop allowing my work to be absorbed without context. The system already depended on me. It just didn't know it yet. There was no thrill in this realization. No sense of victory, only calm. I understood the terrain now. I knew where the weight was, where it wasn't, and how easily appearances could shift if the underlying structure changed. That knowledge didn't make me reckless. It made me patient. I didn't rush to act because I didn't need to. The power of the position lay in its invisibility. Once revealed publicly, it would lose its effectiveness. So I kept working, I kept documenting, I kept listening, and I waited, not for revenge, but for alignment. For a moment where truth and timing would intersect naturally. The reveal wasn't something I announced, it was something I carried. Once you see clearly, you eventually have to decide what to do with that clarity. I knew I couldn't stay in the same position indefinitely. Not because I was angry, but because the structure itself was misaligned. As long as my work remained foundational and unacknowledged, the system would continue to reward the wrong signals, and I would continue to be shaped by a role that no longer fit. There were several paths open to me. I could confront my manager directly, lay out the documentation, ask for recognition, a title, a seat at the table. It might even work, temporarily. But it would frame the issue as interpersonal, not structural. It would also position me as someone asking to be seen, rather than someone whose value is already evident. I could escalate to leadership, present the record, let them draw conclusions. That path carried risk, not of retaliation, but of becoming a problem to be managed. Organizations are rarely grateful to those who expose uncomfortable truths, even when they're delivered calmly. Or I could change the conditions without making a scene. Step out of the role that allowed others to rely on me invisibly. Force the system to encounter its own gaps. Let clarity emerge through absence rather than accusation. That last option was the most irreversible. It didn't promise validation, it didn't guarantee justice, but it aligned with my values. I didn't want to embarrass anyone. I didn't want to win an argument. I wanted the truth to stand on its own. Choosing that path meant accepting uncertainty. It meant trusting that my work, once removed from the narrative, would leave a noticeable shape. Not immediately, but inevitably. I took time with this decision, weeks, not days. I observed how often my name came up when something broke, how frequently my notes referenced without attribution, how dependent the system had become on my quiet presence. Eventually, the choice stopped feeling dramatic. It felt necessary. Staying would mean continuing to teach others that my role was to support, not to lead. Leaving or repositioning would teach them something else entirely. The decision wasn't fueled by resentment. It was fueled by alignment. I needed my actions to match what I now understood, so I chose the path that didn't require explanation, the one that would speak for itself. Once the decision was made, there was no rush. Urgency would have betrayed intention. I moved the way I always had, calmly, methodically, without drawing attention. The first thing I did was stop absorbing ambiguity. When requests came in that belonged elsewhere, I redirected them gently, in writing, not defensively, not with commentary, just clarity. This looks like it sits with product. I'm happy to support once ownership is confirmed. For tracking purposes, can you note who's responsible for this decision? These were small shifts, but they changed the flow. Work that had previously defaulted to me now had to land somewhere specific. People didn't notice yet. They simply adjusted, assuming this was temporary. At the same time, I began formal conversations, quiet ones, not about grievances, not about credit, about scope, about growth, about where the company saw my role evolving. I asked neutral questions and listened carefully to the answers. They were polite, vague, non-committal. That told me everything I needed to know. So I prepared structurally. I updated my documentation systems so they were complete, current, and accessible, but no longer personalized. I removed myself as the invisible interpreter. If someone wanted clarity, they could read it. If they didn't, I let the confusion surface. I also began exploring options outside the company, quietly, no announcements, no hints, just conversations that helped me understand my market value, not in titles, but in function. What I learned confirmed what I already suspected. The skills I was using to stabilize others were seen elsewhere as leadership capabilities. At work, nothing seemed different. My manager continued to speak confidently. Leadership continued to trust the narrative, but the small frictions were starting to appear. A missed dependency here, a duplicated effort there. Nothing alarming, just inefficiencies that used to disappear without notice. I didn't step in to fix them unless asked directly, and even then, I fixed only what was mine to fix. This wasn't withdrawal. It was precision. Silence at this stage wasn't about waiting. It was about letting the system operate without my invisible corrections, letting cause and effect reconnect. I didn't feel satisfaction watching this happen. I felt calm, the kind of calm that comes from no longer carrying responsibility that was never formally yours. To everyone else, I was still there, still professional, still helpful. What they didn't see was that I had already moved, internally and structurally, away from the role that had kept me unseen. The consequences didn't announce themselves. They arrived the way fog does, gradually, almost politely. At first, it was small things. A meeting ended without clear next steps. An email thread stretched longer than usual because no one consolidated the answers. A decision was revisited because the rationale couldn't be found. These weren't crises, they were inconveniences. The kind that makes people slightly tense without knowing why. I noticed the change before anyone else did, because I recognized the absence. The connective work, the quiet alignment, was no longer happening automatically. And because it had never been named, its disappearance felt like confusion rather than loss. My manager began to ask more questions, not directly to me at first, but in meetings. Did we already decide this? Who owns this dependency? Why is this coming up again? The confidence in his delivery was still there, but it had less ground to stand on. People started looping me in again, instinctively. Old habits die hard. When they did, I responded professionally, but narrowly. I answered the question asked. I pointed to existing documentation. I didn't reconstruct context unless it was explicitly requested. This was where the difference became visible. Without someone synthesizing quietly, the system had to work harder to stay coherent. And it didn't always succeed. Leadership felt it next, not as blame, but as drag. Reviews took longer, plans felt less certain. There was a subtle sense that things weren't as tight as they used to be. No one connected this feeling to me. They connected it to growth pains, to complexity, to the business environment. That was fine. The point was never to be recognized through absence. The point was for the structure to reveal itself. I watched as my manager began to rely more heavily on formal artifacts, slides, dashboards, summaries. Without the underlying record, these artifacts became fragile. Questions that used to be answered effortlessly now require follow-up. Confidence started to lean on reassurance rather than clarity. There was no confrontation, no accusation, just a slow exposure of how much had been held together quietly. And still, I stayed steady. I didn't withdraw emotionally. I didn't gloat. I did my job. I met my commitments. I simply no longer compensated for everyone else's. The consequences weren't punishment. They were information. And information, once it surfaces, changes how people behave, even if they don't yet understand why. By the time the discomfort became visible, the window to quietly correct it had already closed. Leadership began asking broader questions, not about any one failure, but about why things felt harder to manage. Why is alignment required for more meetings? Why didn't it seem to stick the way it used to? These were not accusations. They were expressions of unease. My manager felt it too. I could see it in the way he prepared more, spoke longer, filled silences that hadn't needed filling before. He began to reference process gaps and growing pains more often. He scheduled check-ins with me that were framed as casual, but carried an undercurrent of concern. "Anything I should be aware of?" he asked once. I paused before answering, not theatrically, just thoughtfully. "Everything I'm seeing is already in the documentation," I said. Which was true. It was all there. It always had been. What he wanted, I realized, wasn't information, it was reassurance. The kind I used to provide without being asked, the kind that smoothed uncertainty before it could surface. But reassurance only works when it's continuous. Once interrupted, it can't simply be turned back on without addressing why it was needed in the first place. People started trying to fix things retroactively, processes were revisited, new tools were discussed, task forces were formed. None of this addressed the core issue, because the issue wasn't procedural. It was relational and structural. The system had become dependent on invisible labor, and no one had thought to name it until it was gone. There was a moment, quiet, almost sad, when I realized that even if I stepped back into my old role fully, it wouldn't resolve what had been exposed. Too many assumptions had been revealed. Too many narratives had lost their coherence. Trust, once strained, doesn't reset with effort alone. My manager tried to reassert control. He took on more, delegated less, and spoke with greater certainty. But certainty without grounding is exhausting. I could see the strain, and I felt no satisfaction in it, only distance. What struck me most was how quickly panic leads to distortion. Small issues were treated as emergencies. Minor disagreements became escalations. People searched for a fix without understanding what they were fixing. And still, no one asked the right question, not because they were incapable, but because systems resist self-examination. It's easier to add layers than to acknowledge misalignment. Easier to adjust outputs than to revisit foundations. By the time anyone considered whether something essential had been quietly removed, it was already too late to pretend it hadn't mattered. The system had felt the loss. It just didn't yet understand its shape. The conversation, when it finally happened, was almost disappointingly calm. My manager asked for a meeting. No urgency in the calendar invite. No agenda beyond sync. When I walked into the room, he looked tired, not panicked, not angry, just worn down by the effort of holding together something that no longer held itself. He started by talking about growth, about complexity, about how the company was at an inflection point. I listened, the way I always had, without interrupting. When he finished, there was a pause, not a dramatic one, just space. "I want to understand how you're feeling about your role," he said. That was the opening, not for accusation, not for release, for truth. I didn't bring out documents. I didn't list grievances. I didn't recount every moment of erasure. I spoke carefully, not to protect him, but to stay aligned with myself. "I've been operating as connective tissue," I said, holding context, decisions, and dependencies together. That work has been critical, but it hasn't been visible, and it hasn't been owned structurally. He nodded slowly, no defense, no denial. "I stopped filling gaps that weren't formally mine," I continued. "Not to make a point, to understand what the system actually depends on." That landed. I could see it in his posture, in the way he leaned back, as if recalibrating his understanding of the past year. He asked if I felt underappreciated. I considered the word. "It's not about appreciation," I said. "It's about alignment. The role I've been playing and the role I've been assigned don't match the impact of the work." There was no argument, no raised voice, just a quiet recognition that something fundamental had been misread for too long. He admitted, without prompting, that he had relied on me more than he had realized, that he had assumed stability was natural rather than maintained, that he had told a story that made sense from his vantage point without fully understanding what it rested on. I didn't correct him. I didn't need to. The acknowledgement was enough. The conversation ended without resolution. No promises, no immediate fixes, just clarity. And clarity in that moment was irreversible. I didn't walk out of that conversation feeling triumphant. I walked out feeling light, not because everything had been resolved, it hadn't, but because I was no longer carrying a version of myself that didn't fit. For the first time in a long while, my internal understanding and my external actions were aligned. In the weeks that followed, things shifted in small, tangible ways. My role was discussed more explicitly. Ownership was clarified. I was invited into conversations earlier, not to clean up outcomes, but to shape them. Some of that change came from awareness. Some of it came from necessity. Either way, it marked a boundary that hadn't existed before. But the most important change wasn't organizational. It was personal. I no longer measured my value by how smoothly everything ran. I stopped equating silence with professionalism. I understood that calm doesn't require invisibility, and that restraint doesn't mean erasure. I became more deliberate with my energy. I still documented, still clarified, still connected, but I did so from a place of choice, not obligation. When something wasn't mine to hold, I let it go without guilt. I also became clearer about my future. Whether within that company or elsewhere, I knew I wouldn't return to a role that depended on my quiet endurance. I wanted work that recognized structure as leadership and clarity as authority. People around me adjusted, some with respect, some are in confusion, a few with discomfort. That was inevitable. When you redefine yourself, you disrupt expectations. But disruption doesn't have to be loud to be effective. What I carry now is not bitterness, but precision. I understand how systems work, how narratives form, and how easily quiet people are overlooked. Not because they lack strength, but because they refuse to perform it. I didn't become louder, I became clearer. And that clarity changed everything. There's a story we're often told about power, that it belongs to the loudest voice in the room, the most visible leader, the person who claims space without hesitation. But that story is incomplete. Real power, the kind that sustains systems and shapes outcomes, often lives somewhere quieter. It lives with the people who remember why decisions were made, who notices when narratives drift away from reality, who holds context not for recognition, but because someone has to. For a long time, I believed that kind of power would eventually be recognized on its own, that if I stayed steady long enough, the system would correct itself. What I learned is this: systems don't self-correct out of fairness. They correct when clarity is restored, when invisible labor becomes visible, either through acknowledgement or through absence. Justice in this story didn't come from exposing anyone. It didn't come from revenge or even from validation. It came from alignment, from refusing to carry what was never named, from letting structure reveal truth without emotional force. I didn't need to humiliate anyone to reclaim my footing. I didn't need to raise my voice to be heard. I simply stopped participating in my own erasure. If there's a moral here, it's not speak up at all costs. It's this: silence is only strength when it's chosen. When silence becomes the default, it teaches others how to treat you. When it becomes intentional, it becomes a boundary. For anyone listening who has been dependable for years, who has been called the glue, the fixer, or the one who keeps things together, I want you to hear this clearly. Your clarity is leadership. Your restraint is not a flaw. But your presence must be paired with structure, or it will be absorbed and forgotten. You don't owe anyone your quiet endurance. You owe yourself alignment. I'll end with a question, not rhetorical, but open and real. Have you ever realized that the system you were holding together never learned how to see you? And if so, what would change if you stopped holding it quietly? If this story resonated with you, I'd like to hear your answer in the comments.